Eddie Futch had trained world champions for 30 years. He had stood in corners through hundreds of professional fights. He had watched men get hit with everything the sport had to offer and kept his composure through all of it. He had never, not once in 3 decades, walked away from a training session and questioned everything he believed about combat. Until the afternoon he spent with Bruce Lee in a gym in Los Angeles. The next morning he called Joe Frazier, said he needed time, said something had happened that he needed to sit with before he could explain it properly. He never fully explained it, but what he said in pieces, in conversations over the following months and years, adds up to something extraordinary, something that changes how you think about expertise, about mastery, and about what it means to truly understand something you have spent your life studying. This is that story. The man who built champions. Before we get to the gym, before we get to what happened between these two men, you need to understand who Eddie Futch actually was, because his name is less famous than the fighters he trained. That is always the way with great coaches. The athlete gets the spotlight. The person who built the athlete works in the shadow. Eddie Futch worked in the shadow for 30 years and built things that the spotlight came to worship. He trained Joe Frazier, Smokin' Joe, the man who handed Muhammad Ali his first professional loss, one of the most devastating left hooks in the history of the sport. Futch built that, not just the punch, the fighter behind the punch, the strategy, the conditioning, the mental architecture that allowed a man to walk into the center of the most hostile atmosphere in professional sport and perform at his absolute best. He trained Ken Norton, Larry Holmes, Alexis Arguello, names that meant something in that world, names that still mean something. He was not a man who was easily impressed by other people's ideas about fighting. He had seen too many ideas. He had tested them against reality, against real opponents, real pressure, real consequence, and he knew which ones held and which ones dissolved the moment they met something serious. He believed in what he knew, deeply, with the earned confidence of someone who has been right often enough to trust his own judgment. That confidence was about to encounter something it had no category for. How the afternoon came together. It was 1972. The arrangement was made through a mutual contact in the Los Angeles sports world. A filmmaker who knew both men, who had been talking to Bruce Lee about movement and to Eddie Futch about boxing, and had realized slowly that they were talking about the same things from entirely different angles. He suggested they meet. Just talk. Compare notes. 2 experts in human combat from different disciplines. Eddie Futch agreed with a mild curiosity of a man who has done enough in his career to be interested in almost anything without being particularly expectant about any of it. He arrived at the gym first, set up, waited. His first impression of Bruce Lee, walking through the door in the specific way Bruce Lee always walked through doors, which people consistently described as the walk of a man who was always precisely where he intended to be, was that he was smaller than expected, lighter than expected. Futch had spent 30 years with heavyweight boxers. His frame of reference for dangerous men was calibrated accordingly. He reminded himself that size was a boxing category, not a measure of capability. He had seen small men do things to large men that defied the arithmetic. He knew better than to use his eyes before he used his judgment. He extended his hand, they shook, and in the handshake, in that single moment of contact, something happened that Futch described years later as the first signal. Not alarming, not dramatic, just a signal. He said the handshake felt like shaking hands with something that was entirely awake, not in the metaphorical sense, in the literal, physical sense of a body where every system was fully engaged and fully present. No part of it on standby, no part of it elsewhere. He had shaken hands with Joe Frazier 10,000 times. He knew what a trained fighter's hand felt like. This was different. This was something he did not have a word for yet. The first 30 minutes and the false comfort. The first part of the session was conversation, theory, philosophy. Bruce Lee asked Futch about his approach to training, how he thought about the relationship between a fighter's strengths and their opponent's weaknesses, how he built game plans, how he managed the psychological dimension, the fear, the ego, the specific pressure of performing under conditions where failure is immediate and visible and painful. Futch answered carefully, professionally, with the measured precision of a man who has thought about these questions for 30 years and has good, tested answers to all of them. Bruce Lee listened the way he always listened, completely, without the subtle body language of someone composing their next sentence. Just listening. Then he asked follow-up questions, not challenging questions, curious ones. But each question landed on a specific point in Futch's answer and applied a small, precise pressure, not to collapse the answer, just to see what was underneath it. Futch noticed this. He was a man who had spent 30 years reading people, fighters, promoters, journalists, opponents' coaches, and he recognized a specific quality of intelligence that asked questions not to fill silence, but to find the exact shape of what you were saying. He thought, this is a very sharp man. This is going to be a good conversation. That was the comfort. That was the pleasant, professional, collegial comfort of two knowledgeable people in the same room finding common ground. It lasted until they stood up and began to move. If you love Bruce Lee stories, subscribe. I post rare stories every day. When they stood up, everything changed. The transition from conversation to movement was natural, unforced. Bruce Lee suggested they look at some of the things they had been discussing in physical terms rather than verbal ones. Futch agreed. This was his language too. The body always told you more than the mouth. They began slowly. Bruce Lee demonstrated some of his fundamental positions, his guard, his footwork, the specific geometry of how he occupied space. Futch watched with the professional attention of a coach who has spent 30 years studying how fighters use their bodies, looking for the familiar categories: lead hand, rear hand, weight distribution, center of gravity, the angles of attack and defense. He found some of what he expected: the economy of motion that serious training always produced, the absence of wasted movement. But there was something else, something that didn't fit the categories, a quality of readiness that was not the readiness he knew from boxing. Boxing readiness was focused forward, toward the opponent, organized around the specific geometry of two people facing each other with their hands up. Bruce Lee's readiness was everywhere, omnidirectional, not positioned toward anything in particular, available in every direction simultaneously without being committed to any of them. Futch tried to describe it later and found it genuinely difficult. The closest he got was, it was like the difference between a door that opens one way and water. A door is ready to move in a specific direction. Water is ready to move in any direction. He was water. He asked Bruce Lee to move at something close to actual speed, and the afternoon changed completely. What Futch saw at speed. Eddie Futch had timed punches with a stopwatch for 30 years. He had calibrated his eye to boxing speed, which was, by any reasonable measure, the standard for human striking velocity. What he saw when Bruce Lee moved at something approaching full speed reorganized everything he thought he knew about that calibration. It was not simply that Bruce Lee was fast. Fast was a category Futch understood. He had trained fast fighters. He knew what fast looked like and how to read it and how to train against it. This was something different from fast, something that seemed to exist at a different relationship with time itself. He said afterward, in boxing, speed is about how quickly the punch travels from A to B. I understand that speed. I have measured it, trained it, developed it in fighters for 30 years. What Bruce Lee had was something before the punch. The decision and the execution were the same thing. There was no moment between intention and arrival. They happened simultaneously. That is not speed as I understand speed. That is something else. He asked Bruce Lee to demonstrate the 1-inch punch, the thing he had heard about from multiple sources and had privately filed under impressive trick rather than practical application. Bruce Lee demonstrated it on a pad that Futch held. Futch held the pad, felt the impact, put the pad down, stood very still for a moment, then picked it up and said, again. Bruce Lee did it again. Futch set the pad down a second time and said something that the filmmaker, who was present in the gym that afternoon, repeated many times in the years that followed. He said, that is not possible within what I know, which means either what I know is wrong or incomplete, and I have spent 30 years building what I know. He looked at Bruce Lee. Which is it? Bruce Lee said, calmly and without any edge, both. The conversation that lasted until dark. They sat down. The physical portion of the afternoon was over, but neither man moved toward the door, because something had opened up that needed to be talked through, not for politeness, not to fill time, because both of them were the kind of person who could not encounter a genuine question and leave it unanswered. Futch asked Bruce Lee to explain what he meant. Both. Bruce Lee said, what you know is right. Everything you have built works. It has produced champions. It is precise and tested and real. It is also built on a set of assumptions that stop it at a certain point, not because the assumptions are wrong, because they are assumptions. And every assumption is also a wall. Futch said, "What assumptions?" Bruce Lee thought for a moment, then said, "That fighting is something you do, that it is a set of skills you apply, that the gap between your decision and your action is an engineering problem to be minimized through training." He paused. What if the gap is not an engineering problem? What if the gap itself is the thing to be dissolved, not minimized, dissolved, so that the decision and the action are one thing instead of two things separated by the smallest possible interval? Futch looked at him for a long time, then said, "If you dissolve the gap entirely, you would have something that was no longer reaction. It would be something before reaction." Bruce Lee said, "Yes." Futch sat with that. "That is not boxing," he said finally. Bruce Lee said, "No, but it is what boxing is trying to reach. What every fighting discipline is trying to reach. Most of them spend their time making the approach better. I am interested in the destination." The climax, what Futch said before he left. The gym was dark by the time they finished. Neither had noticed the light going. They walked out together, stood in the parking lot for a moment in the way that people stand at the end of a conversation that has been too large to simply walk away from. Futch said, "I need to think about this." Bruce Lee nodded, said that was the only reasonable response. Futch looked at him and said something that he rarely spoke about publicly, but that the filmmaker heard clearly and never forgot. He said, "I have trained fighters for 30 years. I have worked with the best in the world. I have been proud of that work, and I should be. It is good work. But this afternoon I have seen something that makes me wonder whether all of it, all 30 years, has been building a very sophisticated version of the wrong thing." He paused. "Not wrong, incomplete. You said both. I think you were being kind. I think it might just be incomplete." He got in his car, then rolled the window down and said one last thing. "If what you have is teachable, if there is a way to bring other people to where you are, that would change everything. Not just martial arts. Everything." Bruce Lee said, "It is teachable, but you cannot teach it by adding things. You can only teach it by removing them." Futch nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something he had suspected and been unable to articulate until that moment. Then he drove away. And the next morning he called Joe Frazier and said he needed time. If you love Bruce Lee stories, subscribe. I post rare stories every day. What happened after? The resignation that wasn't. The resignation is technically accurate, but slightly misleading. Eddie Futch did not quit in frustration or defeat. He did not walk away from boxing because Bruce Lee had shown him something better. He stepped back, temporarily, deliberately, the way a serious person steps back from something they love when they realize they have been doing it from inside a set of assumptions they no longer fully trust. He took 6 weeks, went back through everything he knew, not to discard it, to examine it, to look at 30 years of accumulated knowledge and ask honestly, what is this actually built on? What are the assumptions underneath the techniques? And are those assumptions as solid as I have always believed? He came back, to Frazier, to the gym, to the work he had built his life around. But the people who worked with him after that period said something had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that was easy to point to and explain, but in the specific quality of his attention, in the questions he asked, in the willingness to look underneath the things he knew for what was underneath them. He was, as one of his fighters described it, less certain and more accurate at the same time. That is what an afternoon with Bruce Lee had done. Not destroyed 30 years of expertise, expanded the ground it stood on, added something underneath it, or more precisely, revealed something that had always been there, waiting to be found. The moral hit, the thing every expert needs to hear. Here is the uncomfortable truth that Eddie Futch sat with for 6 weeks. Expertise is real. It is valuable. 30 years of working with elite fighters had given Eddie Futch something genuine and rare and powerful. His knowledge had produced champions. It was not in question. But expertise has a shadow side. The longer you spend mastering something, the harder it becomes to see the assumptions you built the mastery on. They become invisible. They become the floor you stand on, rather than the choices you made. You stop seeing them as choices at all. And when something arrives that operates from a different set of assumptions, or no assumptions at all, it does not just challenge your expertise, it challenges your ability to see it clearly. Because your expertise is also your lens, and every lens has blind spots. Bruce Lee had found the blind spot in every system he encountered. Not because he was smarter than Eddie Futch. He wasn't, not in any simple sense. But because he had made it his specific practice to find the assumptions underneath everything. To ask not just, does this work, but what does this assume, and is that assumption necessary? And when you do that work long enough, consistently enough, honestly enough, you stop accumulating expertise and start dissolving the thing that expertise was protecting you from, which is the truth underneath the expertise. Raw, unstructured, impossible to teach directly, but unmistakable when you encounter it. Eddie Futch encountered it on a Tuesday afternoon in a gym in Los Angeles and spent the rest of his career working from a slightly different floor.